Great day in the morning, as I said the other day. Welcome to Nikos. I'm Jonathan Albin. I am Game Master Jay, and we are here on Game Master's Soapbox. And the dire news that we are possibly reaching the end of role playing as you know it is upon us. And I don't mean to be the bearer of bad tidings, and as a matter of fact, I would say I'm a bringer of glad tidings because the end of role playing, as you know, it means role playing is evolving. And those of you that are not yet familiar with the NycosRPG, let me tell you, we are talking about a whole other ball game when it comes to role playing. We're going to be talking about that today in some detail, and so let's get right after it, shall we? Before we go there, though, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and if you like what you see, make sure you click the subscribe button, click the bell, and you get all the notifications of all the new releases. And also, if you would, give a like and leave a comment for us on the video so that we are aware of what's going on. Now, this is being recorded on Twitch, so if you are online with me on Twitch and you wish to, feel free to drop a chat in because I am actually reading the chats and I will read your chat on the air and respond to it near the end of the broadcast. So let's go after this, though. What is it when I say that we are talking about the end of role playing as we know it? Well, one of the things that has defined role playing games for most players is the concept of having to spend a few minutes at the beginning of the character's life, if you will, and occasionally throughout you have to make decisions about what class you're going to advance in. And the concept here is that there will be no more classes. In the future, role playing will be more realistic in that it will be treated the same way we treat our lives. We do not choose a specific pathway and ignore all else to pursue it. Far from that. As a matter of fact, even if we did, we would still not have the limitations of not being allowed to take on other skills. We'd be able to advance in any direction that we choose to. And so a mechanism that will be coming up will be getting rid of classes. It will be getting rid of the concept of hit point pools. It'll be getting rid of experience points. It will be giving an endless advancement opportunity to every character in any way that the player chooses. There will be no longer any genre limitations, so your character could be theoretically played in a fantasy setting in one week and in a space fantasy setting the next, all depending on the choices of your storytellers and game masters. But even the dice roll and combat systems that you're familiar with are all going to change. And the NycosRPG mechanism is a way that's going to happen. And I will be going over each one of these points in a great amount of detail as we go through today's broadcast. So I want to thank you all for being here, and let's get after it. So when I say that there will be no more classes, one of the biggest challenges when you create a character is you have to make a decision, a hard decision, really, if you think about it when you're first starting to play, to choose which channel, which narrow band of skills you want your persona in the game to pursue. In classic Dungeons and Dragons, you had fighters, wizards, thieves, clerics, and then you had some specialty ones that might be added as well, the paladin and the ranger and such like. But the classes were a restriction because once you started down that path, the skills and abilities you would advance in would be dedicated to that specific line of work, if you will. And although we all get used to that in our play life nowadays, many of the online RPs and such have classes and such, there has been a move within that marketplace to move away from that and to give characters more options. As a matter of fact, even inside the Dungeons and Dragons model itself, there have been changes in the recent editions and recent releases to allow, for example, an arcane knight or an arcane trickster or a warrior you can have different classes with skills from other places, but it got muddled and confusing and ultimately was a problem anyway. So by avoiding classes at the very beginning, you give your character more freedom to advance in any direction they want to right from the very first session. So this also obviates the need for having to look up your advancements each time to see what your new bonuses are, because the system isn't going to be limited by class features and the like, and so you won't have to keep referring to those. As a matter of fact, you'll know what your particular skill is week over week, and we'll get more into that as we get further down in this sequence. Just realize that the loss of classes, while it may seem like a loss of direction, I remember the first time I even conceived of this, the idea of not having a class was so alien to my own mind that it took some grinding to get to how we could do it. And the way we've done that is that you have ways of training that are still aligned with the old kinds of class structure, but they're literally only as a framework of how you might have learned a particular skill. You might have learned it from somebody who had a career that was tangential to those old titles. But we'll get more into that later. Now, the next one is probably the more challenging one to get your brain around, and that is that there are no more hit points. And this is because most of us are not even aware of the origin of the hit point pool concept. The game has been around for 48 or so years. As long as I've been playing, there's been a game, because I literally learned from one of the guys who designed Dungeons and Dragons back in the 70s. And at that time, one of the biggest going concerns, I know it's going to sound crazy, was what they called at the time classic tabletop war games. And in those war games, you would have a points score allotted to your logistics. And many times the conflict objective was to eliminate your opponent's logistics pool before your own was depleted or destroyed. And the reason for that was because during World War II, and this is 1940s, during World War II, we realized pretty early in the war that the easiest way to defeat an opponent wasn't necessarily to match him on the battlefield with the best units and the best shells and the best armor. It was to determine what was allowing them to be a war-fighting system, deplete them of one or more of their resources, and thereby prevent them from being able to continue the war effort. This concept of depletion is also sometimes called resource refusal, or you are eliminating their resource supply chains. And when you use a supply chain warfighting, you're going after not the enemy's positions militarily, but their oil depots or their hardware repair facilities or their production for ammunition, munitions dumps. And you can actually see this if you go back and look at classic World War II era movies. Almost always they are going after one or another of these resources as their objective. And even if they are going unit versus unit, they still are going for that which allows them to continue. So they are blowing up the munitions dump, or they're lighting their fuel on fire or whatever. But this concept is the part that you have to understand. When you are trying to emulate that in a war game, you create a arbitrary number, usually built on actual numeric things like how many barrels of oil they might have at a depot, or the number of ammunition cases they can produce in a month. It all depends on the scale. But you're doing this so that you can determine what the threshold for victory will be. How much of what they have do you have to take away to stop them from fighting? Because once you take away their ability to war fight, they will surrender. And that concept is what carried over into Dungeons and Dragons. I know it seems a far afield from it now, but that concept is exactly where the concept of hit points came from. A character's hit points were his, in effect, ability to warfight. So if you eliminate a player's hit points, you're effectively taking away their resource pool and therefore causing them to be able to no longer fight. This is why when Dungeons and Dragons first started and they talked about the combat rounds and being a flurry of activity, and a round was a minute, I know it seems crazy now. We think of a round being 6 seconds, but initially a round was a full minute, and if your storyteller was into dynamics, he would grant you segments of your round. So your action would go off in the, based on your initiative, the X segment of that round. And therefore it was how many seconds after the start of the clock, so to speak. And for example, nowadays spellcasters will freak out at this, but back in my day, take my teeth out, act like I'm 90 years old. Back in my day, when you were a spellcaster, the level of your spell was how many combat rounds you would have to continue to be casting for the spell to go off. This is early on. This changed rapidly when they realized that players were perceiving of the die rolls being their attack in each round, and that's when they started to switch from the 1 minute round to the 60-second, the 10-second round, and all of that. They got all confusing. But the concept here is that the hit point pool was this target that you were aiming at, and you were trying to deplete your opponent's hit points and therefore keep them from war fighting. And this therefore meant that your character didn't necessarily die when he reached 0, because they were emulating on the warfighting style in war games the concept of breaking a unit. When you demoralized it and made it so that it was no longer wanting to fight, it was removed from the field of play. Not that it was eliminated, but it simply was taken out of action because it was no longer serviceable. And these are all terms that, in an antiseptic and analytic tabletop way, made perfect sense. When you switch it up to a role-playing game and a player goes to 0 hit points, if you have a point before 0 that you could convince a unit to not fight anymore, you could probably do that. But we as human beings think, well, I could play all the way down to the last point, and therefore character death became a thing. Idea was you played until the numbers ran out, and if you were doing it right, if you were playing well, you were depleting your opponent's hit points and stopping them before they took away your hit points. And what the NycosRPG does instead is it considers the life essence of a person to be more like a barometer. We fundamentally can operate all the way until 0. I mean, we can keep fighting until we are literally knocked out. But that's generally not how physical conflict, even in a situation of a gunfight, doesn't necessarily happen that way. You keep going until somebody wins or somebody loses, and then you're done. And it's hard to define that using a hit point system, because a player is simply going to say, I still have points left, I can still go. I'm ready to fight on and carry forward. When you take that away and you say, no, you continue to act, but the longer you refuse to act, the more strenuous, the longer you continue to act, the more strain you're putting on your system, to the point where you become so fatigued that you can't continue and you literally have to rest. And that even doesn't finish it. That just means you cannot in that round of rest physically harm your opponent, even if you quote win the engagement, because you're not prepping a weapon and you're not ready for the fight. So it causes the back and forth of the dynamics of the combat to radically change. And we'll go more into this when we get down to the penultimate section, when we get down to dealing with QDR and things like that. But we're not going to cover right now. Make sure you stick around to the end for that. The concept here is that your hit points pools are gone. So a fight scene is not going to be taking the 2 hours, 3 hours, or more that it's taking now, because players won't have these monstrous amounts of hit points at moderately high level that make it difficult to follow through and complete on. It will be instead much shorter and much more cinematic. We'll get more to that in a minute. Now, these are all things that seem to be going away. No more classes, no more hit points. Now we're going to talk about no more experience points. Wait, how I'm not getting any more experience points? I'm doing all of this? What am I doing all this for if I'm not getting experience points? Well, first of all, let me first clarify. Getting rid of experience points only does you a favor. The tracking of experience points means you have to provide the game master with a threshold which you are aiming at, and only when you achieve that number of experience points do you earn the privilege as a player to advance your character. Now, that's the standard. It's what we've been used to. It's what's going to feel comfortable. But I'm telling you, honestly, a system can be made that allows for constant and continuous advancement, as we're going to, whereby the storyteller is not involved in the advancement of the character. Yeah. Hey, I get it. Crickets here. What? That makes no sense. The issue here is that advancement in the NycosRPG and in this new mechanism that I think is going to change the way people play games. This new mechanism means that every time you attempt a skill, whether you succeed or not, that skill will advance. Because the reality is if we're trying to learn to do something and we practice it, if we are utilizing it in the game dynamic, we are therefore obviously practicing it. And in any case where we are working on something and we put some effort into it, we are getting better. We are either learning from our mistakes or we are seeing where we've succeeded. So the idea here is that there will be continuous and endless advancement for player characters. So the persona in the game, as you accomplish a task, as you fail at a task, that task's difficulty level is reduced. You actually get a little bit better at doing it, therefore your skill improves. You'll see how it goes here in a minute. This idea, therefore, of getting rid of experience points is only lifting away from the game master the burden of determining a scaling process that requires him to put monster type into CR and then doing a calculation and then determine how many experience points each one is worth divided by the number of players, blah, 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 blah. And it makes the scoring of the game, the advancement of the game, unfun for anybody. The player wants to advance all the time. Every session you're in, you want to be getting better. But you can't see that unless you gain experience points. And the storyteller might be using a milestone, or he might be using a flat base, or he might be doing an accelerated base. There's so many different ways that he can calculate experience points. But that, again, is putting a burden on him and taking away the agency of the players because they can't advance as they get lucky or as they get successful or whatever. And so having a methodology that allows for something other than an experience points pool is going to be good. So now we're going to switch and talk a little bit about the advantages of the system that we're talking about, this NycosRPG. So we're going to start right there where we just came from. No experience points, great. But if I'm a player in the game, I want to be able to advance, right? We want to be able to get better at the things we want to get better at. So if the game gives you the opportunity to advance a skill once per session, for every skill that you use in game, three things happen. Number one, you're going to try more things because if you've got more options of things you couldn't advance, you'll try to advance them all. Now, if you can. Number two, you're going to be advancing the skills that are most commonly used first to make sure they get to a serviceable level. And you'll understand what I mean there in a minute. If you're learning how to ride a bicycle, you want to be able to know that when you get on the bicycle, you can ride it in any terrain. So therefore, practicing your bike riding in rougher terrain makes you better at riding the bicycle, and that experience confers over to being better in any environment. So the concept of conflict and challenge causing you to use your abilities, your skills, then those skills are going to advance. Now, the stepped way in which advancement occurs is only an incremental way, simply because it, again, emulates what is in real life. When we are attempting to practice a skill, we get out and I'm going to work on lifting. So I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to go lift some barbells or whatever. That process of doing that action does improve my ability time over time, but it's only when I'm actually doing it that I can experience that growth. So I know there's a lot of us that had New Year's resolutions that we were going to spend time in the gym this year, and here it is June, and I don't know how many of you are still on your resolutions. Bless you if you are, and bless your heart if you haven't. Those of you from the Southwest know what I'm talking about. The Southeast know what I'm talking about. Bless your heart. The concept here is that the advancement is stepped only to allow it to be a gradual process. So, because we don't want to, get through. How many of you play video games and know how many hours it takes to complete a certain kind of a game? Yeah. When you play video games and they have that kind of a mechanism in there, you have to grind, right? You have to go and do something over and over again. Well, this is going to be more enjoyable than that because the advancement is constant and fundamentally endless. Because even if let's say you get lucky and you've advanced until you have 95% in any given skill, that still gives you a billion other things that you could be practicing. So maybe you've learned how to use your sword and shield, but what if you use the sword and shield and you specifically are now going to learn how to disarm your opponent? That can be a new skill that you add, and so you're never running out of you're never running out of things to advance. And so this system affords an endless advancement opportunity, which means that characters don't have to be retired out at Paragon level. The game master doesn't have to throw up his hands because there's no monsters that a player can be challenged with above that level because of their near godlike Paragon status. Instead, the number of skills and the number of possibilities goes on and on and on. And the same with the villains and the monsters and the dangers. They also can be from wholly new angles that haven't even been considered. And there's a whole lot more coming to that. But actually, that leads directly to my next point. There aren't any genre limitations, which means the NycosRPG mechanism is available and will be releasing new genre packs called system books over the next few months and years. And those system books will cover the details of how to administer a game in a dozen. Right now, I've got 7 that are already on the docket. So, actually, nearly infinite number of potential genres, because each genre is going to have its own unique skills list. It's going to have its own methodology for the use of those skills. There'll be ways to do comparatives between them, and there's so many things that allow for there not to be any limitations. The players can literally learn in any genre, and many characters can simply move from one genre to the other because they're generalists, and that's a whole other ball of wax. Now, all of that has led up to this next part, and that is that the combat round is changing because the idea of combat has changed. If any of you have watched a recent, as I say, my tongue on my cheek, a recent gunfight, like in a John Wick's movie or Ocean's 11, the dynamic structures of the way conflicts occur are considerably more sophisticated, more cinematic, quicker, actions-packed, exciting. Whereas if you go back and look at classic war scenes from World War II, movies that were made in the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s, combat was a slog. People fought with roundhouse punches. There was a lot of back and forth as the hero could hold his own even against, myriad enemies. But the point is that combat slog in a role-play game that we are all familiar with, and I know that many people will pick on the Dungeons and Dragons franchise in particular, but it doesn't matter. Any combat system where there is a pool of hit points that have to be taken away, it leads to a combat slog because the success opportunities are against a smaller amount of damage, and therefore it takes forever to just grind through it. This replaces all of that. Second of all, even the way we're going to look at dice changes. Now, you may have seen my QDR videos, and the quantum die rolling mechanism that I established for this is a revolutionary way to look at a single die roll. Most of us know that in most games you have a die roll threshold. Let's say, for example, a armor class of 15. So you need to overcome an armor class of 15. On a flat roll with no modifiers, that would be a d20 roll above a 15. If you have modifiers in the right statistics, then you would also get a modifier, which would bring that 15 maybe down by a +3 to a 12. So now it's a 12 or better. It's still a single threshold. You still are just that one number matters. You got to be over that 12. Well, the NycosRPG, the quantum die rolling mechanism says this. One dice roll is going to generate 5 or maybe even 6 possible responses. And what I mean by that is that every die roll is going to be determined looking at it from a new perspective. The die roll is going to be considered against not only your original die roll value, but a double up and what's called a double down. A double up is literally twice the threshold, and the double down is 1/2 of the threshold. I call it double down because double down sounds cool. I know it's halving down. So halving down and doubling up. It's double up, double down. That gives you three threshold numbers within the die roll. So if you roll a d20, you roll percentage dice. NycosRPG is based on percentage dice because it's more intuitive, and we comprehend what 40% of something is. We understand that number easier. So you're going to be rolling. Let's say the threshold is 40. Your original threshold was 40. That's your skill level. Then a double up would be 40 times 2 or 80%. Your double down would be 40 divided by 2 or 20%. So that 20 to 60 window, the 20 to 80 window is 60 points. Yeah. What's important about that, therefore, is that your chances of rolling the proper number is increased. And here's why. On a roll of 20 or below, that is a nominal or straight success. You've gotten to your threshold if you roll that number or lower. If you have succeeded in rolling below the half value, or in this case 20, then your success isn't just a great success, it's a wild success. That counts, if you will, more than your initial success. And so therefore, now you get additional benefits for having succeeded even better than expected. And there's also the possibility that you've rolled over your 40. But the number over 40 could be 40 to 80. So that gives you a 40% chance of a partial success. And if we think of the way we live our lives and we do things, we try to do a good deed and we fall short. Maybe we only fall short a little bit. So this game takes that into account and offers kind of a grace to the players, if you will, because they can get some benefit of success by reaching a partial. So now you've got partial, full, and wild success. Well, then it gets to even be more. A perfect success or complete success occurs when you roll exactly 0, 1 out of 100. 1 out of 100 is pretty special. And in the number of games that I've seen dice rolled for, it's pretty significant when you get that 1%. So there's always that golden bullet, that 1% that is a absolutely complete success. We'll go more into these in a minute. And then finally, above the double up partial success is the window of failure. And that window of failure goes all the way to 99, in which case there's also, in certain cases, an absolute failure. And so you got absolute failure on one side, complete success on the other, and then we've now got a spectrum. And this concept of spectrum is literally what I mean when I say quantum die roll, because with one die roll, you're actually hitting potentially 5 windows, and the variation in your skill changes the aperture of that window of potentials that you might roll. So I know I used a couple of technical terms there, and there's a complete video on QDR. I recommend you go look at. The link for that is right up here. Leave my finger here for a second, that way I can catch it on the video and make sure I put in the tag for it right there. And those of you that are on the audio, there is also already one of the Game Master Soapbox Edition episodes that covers quantum die rolling, and I'll mention that again near the end of the show to remind you again. But that's what that does. Now, combat rounds are going to change only because the combat sequence is going to change. Those players who are doing an action that is a combat action are the only ones that really need to worry about the concept of a combat round. Generally speaking, anybody who is doing an action that is not actively swinging at your opponent is not in combat. Generally, if you're swinging at someone or shooting an arrow at someone, well, let me rephrase that. Even arrows are not considered to be a combat action because they can be done from a distance. So the only real combat actions are active responses to missile attacks or hand-to-hand combat. So other than that, there is no need for all the nuances of a long-term sequence, initiative roll, move your dice, move your mice, make your attacks, choose again, and go on. We're not going to do any of that because we don't need to. Instead, we're going to roll against our relative success of our fighting skills. And the opponent is going to do the same thing, and then each player is going to compare against their relative skill. Well, this process means that if we've got 5 options on either side with the double up and double down values, then your propensity to get to your success is still going to be high. For example, let's say we hit the 40, you're going to get a success even all the way down to that 78. You're still getting a partial success. The difference will be that where you stack up against your opponent is going to decide whether somebody wins or somebody loses. And a fight scene doesn't end until one of the sides loses. Now, notice that if you're fighting in a group of people, you can have, therefore, 2 or 3 different losses in the same game and still not lose the battle, because as long as somebody's still fighting, the quote battle is not over. But it does allow us to see that moment when a player gets an edge over his opponent, or maybe the villain has actually gotten an edge over one of the players. That doesn't mean that the fight is over, but what it does allow for is when there's been a success and a failure in the same round, the failure must suffer a consequence, and the consequence is in the form of a condition placed on them by the successor. Now, I'm not going to go into that here at this point. Just know that therefore means that on any given round, you could theoretically have a fight over in 2 or 3 rounds and not even have done much damage to each other at all, because you may have actually lost the battle before you started. So there's a whole lot more to that in the QDR video, and we'll talk more about that also in the combat section when we get to that for Game Master Soapbox. Now, the final thing is that the opportunity for this is therefore every adventure now becomes a golden minefield. My players have told me for some time that, hey, Strigley's back. Everybody say hi to Strigley. Strigley says hi. Strigley's one of the persons that stopped in and subscribed to my channel, and yeah, nice to see you too. I've been here. Many of my episodes have been like a half an hour to an hour, so I haven't been around as long as I have been in certain other cases. But I am definitely glad to see you tonight. Awesome. We are almost done with my official broadcast part, so let me get done with that so that we can get this in the can and send off to the podcast. So give me another moment here. So my players have told me, probably for the last 2 years, there's been quite a bit of controversy as players have argued back and forth. We'll get there, Strigley, I promise. My players say that there are two schools of thought. There's the first school of thought that adventures in a role-playing game are a railroad train. And that train track runs along the way the direct game master wants it to go. And it's generally linear. It generally has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that's all there is you must follow that course. And in that case, the game master is the train conductor, and he's running it as a railroad. Players can't get off, they can't change course, they can't do something that's not on the list of approved actions. And the train, yes. Yeah, the train needs track options. Yes. This is important, but the point I was making is that players think of railroads or they think of sandboxes. And the sandbox is the very opposite. And that's literally the game master sets up the boundaries, sets up the ground rules, and then the players go where they want to go and do what they want to do, playing in the sandbox that the game master has created. And there's problems with that as much as there are problems with the railroads, in that players sometimes are listless, or players aren't digging for new information, or if the game master does share something with them, they shy away from it because they don't want to get caught on a railroad, and so therefore it becomes problematic to have either one of these ideas. Well, one of my groups came up with this. They said, Jonathan, your game is like, you start off with the platform and it looks like it might be a railroad, but the players look across the landscape and they see you've provided adventure hooks at galore. They can go in any direction they want. So then they sort of feel like it's a sandbox. And they see all the shiny objects that are laying out across the sand of this sandbox. But Jonathan, as they start to follow you down the course of one of those towards one of those treasures across the sand, they start to notice that the story is going on around them and the ground is shaking and they are being drawn into the story.